All right, welcome everyone to today's Explainer. We are attempting something pretty ambitious today. We're going to look at a sweeping 600-year era of medieval Indian history. But look, instead of just giving you a dry list of dates and names to memorize, I want you to think of this era as a massive, high-stakes relay race of empires. And in this race, the baton is absolutely not handed over politely. It's snatched. It's taken through ambition, massive disruption, and honestly, sometimes pure ruthlessness. Every single dynasty we're going to explore today totally upends the one that came before it, rewriting the rules of power, culture, and survival across the subcontinent. It is a wildly thrilling narrative, and we're going to map out exactly how this dramatic handover of power actually went down. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for the Explainer. We'll start with the first foreign invasions, move into the birth of the Delhi Sultanate, then we'll look at blood, iron, and intrigue, witness the Khalji revolution, and finally we'll end with the infamous Tughlaq experiments. Just to anchor us before we really get going, take a quick look at this timeline. We are condensing an enormous chunk of time today, over 6 centuries of sweeping changes. We're kicking things off way back in 712 AD with the Arab invasion of Sind. Then we'll move through the devastating raids of Mahmud Ghazni in 1025, hit the incredibly pivotal Second Battle of Turain in 1192, and see the official start of the Delhi Sultanate in 1206. From there, we'll raise through Alauddin Khilji's absolute power grab in 1296, all the way to Muhammad bin Tughlaq's bizarre capital shift in 1327. So this timeline right here, this is basically our spine for today. Let's start with our very first era. Section 1. The first foreign invasions, specifically from Arabia to Sind. So in the 7th and 8th centuries, the Arabian Peninsula was experiencing this explosive, rapid rise of Islam. But you might be wondering, how did this new power actually reach India? Well, it was actually triggered by a local dispute over a looted ship carrying gifts from Sri Lanka. Because of that, a 17-year-old commander named Muhammad bin Qasim was sent over, and by 712 AD, he completely conquered Sind. But here's the thing, this presented a really massive administrative challenge. Early Islamic rules generally offered conquered polytheists 2 choices, convert or face death. But in India, with its unbelievably vast, deeply rooted population, that was literally impossible. So they came up with a highly practical administrative compromise called jizya. The local population was given the status of zimmis, or protected subjects. They paid a specific tax, and in return, they got to keep their lives, their property, a degree of religious freedom, and they didn't have to serve in the military. It was just a very pragmatic solution to govern an enormous new demographic. And this brilliantly illustrates a much larger global consequence of this invasion. The Arab presence in Sind acted like this giant, vital bridge for human knowledge. While the Arabs definitely brought over advanced cartography and a deep understanding of monsoon patterns for maritime trade, the exchange going the other direction was truly world-changing. Just think about it. Indian scientific genius, things like the concept of zero, the decimal system, and Brahmagupta's completely mind-bending mathematical formulas were all translated into Arabic. Along with the surgical techniques of Sushruta and the medical texts of Charaka, this incredible treasure trove of knowledge traveled from India straight into the Arab world, and eventually, it completely transformed Europe. Eventually, though, the Arabs kind of stagnated in Sind. They were blocked by these very powerful Indian kings to the east. Which brings us to a really fascinating question. What happens when climate change and mass starvation force a fierce, newly converted warrior tribe to just pack up and move? Well, the answer is the rise of the Central Asian Turks. Driven right out of their homelands, these absolutely formidable fighters entered the Islamic world originally as slaves. Then they became bodyguards, then generals, and finally, rulers. One of these leaders was Mahmud Ghazni, who unleashed this series of brutal, highly destructive raids into India, most notably sacking the incredibly wealthy Somnath Temple in 1025. But here's the key takeaway with Ghazni. He was mostly there to loot, not to stay. That dynamic totally changes in our next era. Section 2. The birth of the Delhi Sultanate, where slaves become kings. Fast forward to the late 12th century. Muhammad Ghori decides to expand eastward to actually build an empire, and he relies heavily on his most trusted commanders, who, amazingly, were his slaves. His ambition put him on a direct collision course with the incredibly powerful Rajput king Prithviraj Chauhan. Now, in the First Battle of Turain in 1191, Prithviraj Chauhan was aggressive, he was fast, and he basically handed Ghori a completely crushing defeat. But notice the contrast here. Instead of just giving up and going home, Ghori spends a whole year obsessively analyzing his failures and refining his tactics. So when he returns for the Second Battle of Touraine in 1192, the Indian forces, who were unfortunately suffering from a lot of internal fragmentation, were defeated. That single victory permanently changed the trajectory of Indian history, throwing the doors wide open for Muslim rule in Delhi. But it's really vital to remember that history isn't just made by guys with swords. Coinciding exactly with that bloody battle in 1192, a massive, peaceful cultural shift arrived in India. Khwaja Mohyuddin Chishti established the Sufi tradition in Ajmer, and he brought this truly beautiful philosophy, Ishq Hakiki. In a deeply fractured society that was just being torn apart by political warfare, the Sufi saints brought this healing message. They taught that anyone could reach God through pure love and devotion, completely bypassing strict, rigid rituals. This message of love and shared humanity basically acted as a crucial social glue during some incredibly turbulent times. All right, let's step directly into the courts of power now. Section 3, Blood, Iron, and Intrigue, the Mamluk dynasty. Following Ghori's death in 1206, his massive empire was split up. Qutbuddin Aibak stepped up and laid the foundation of the Mamluk dynasty. Now, Mamluk literally means owned. These were highly trained military elites born to free parents, whose loyalty belonged entirely to their master. To help manage the empire, a later sultan named Iltutmish created what I can only describe as an administrative monster, the Turkin-e-Chalgani. This was an elite cabinet of his 40 most loyal, highly capable Turkish slave officers. And initially, this brilliant deep state network totally worked to keep the massive empire functioning. But power corrupts, right? After Iltutmish died, this group of 40 realized something dangerous. They realized they didn't just want to serve the sultan, they wanted to pick the sultan. They turned into these incredibly dangerous kingmakers, acting like puppet masters right behind the throne. But there was one person who absolutely refused to be their puppet, Iltutmish's daughter, Razia Sultan. When the group of 40 tried to install her totally incompetent brother instead of her, Razia pulled off a stunning political masterstroke. She dressed herself in bright red clothing, which was the traditional symbol of someone seeking justice, and she marched directly to the Jama Masjid. She bypassed those elite nobles entirely and appealed directly to the everyday common people of Delhi. The crowds were so deeply moved by her speech that they literally formed a mob, stormed the palace, and put Razia on the throne themselves. It was an unprecedented, completely populist takeover. Though unfortunately, she'd spent her short reign constantly having to battle those exact same treacherous nobles. The chaos of these kingmakers ultimately came to an end when one of their very own decided he wanted absolute, unquestioned control. Enter Ghiyasuddin Balban. The contrast here is just stark. Where the puppet masters thrived on having weak, distracted rulers, Balban, who was a former slave and an original member of the 40 himself, became the Iron Dictator. He systematically and ruthlessly assassinated or destroyed his former colleagues. And to elevate the Sultan from just a political leader to a divine, untouchable figure, he introduced these terrifying Iranian court customs. He demanded sijda, meaning you had to kneel and bow your head all the way to the ground, and paibos, which meant kissing the Sultan's feet. He didn't rule by consensus. He ruled through pure, unadulterated fear. But here's the catch. A system built entirely on one man's terror basically cannot survive his death. Which brings us to Section 4, the Khalji Revolution, Expansion and Control. This next shift was a true revolution because it overthrew 80 years of Turkish racial supremacy. The old elite looked down on this new ruling family, the Khaljis, considering them lower class. The founder of this new dynasty, Jalaluddin Khalji, was an older guy who actually surprised everyone with his extreme leniency. He would literally defeat rebels, untie their chains, and host them for drinks. He hated shedding blood. But his nephew, Alauddin Khalji, he was the exact opposite, cold, calculating, and insanely ambitious. Alauddin went down south and raided the unimaginably wealthy kingdom of Devagiri. When his loving uncle, Jalaluddin, came down to the Ganges River to meet him and congratulate him, Alauddin had him brutally stabbed in the back right in the middle of a hug. He then marched straight on Delhi, and get this, he literally used catapults to throw stolen gold coins at the public to buy their loyalty and silence. Just wild stuff. Now, Alauddin was a total megalomaniac. He actually called himself the Second Alexander. He decided he needed a massive standing army of nearly 500,000 men just to fight off the Mongols and conquer Rajputana. But how do you afford that without completely bankrupting the empire? Well, he commandeered the entire economy. I mean, he's fixed the price of everything: wheat, cloth, horses, slaves, you name it. He created these three strict separate markets in Delhi. To stop corruption in the military, he introduced Dog, which was branding the government horses, and Chera, a written biometric log of every single soldier. And to make sure no merchant ever dared to overcharge, he deployed a terrifying network of spies. If a merchant was caught short-weighing a customer, Alauddin ordered that an exact equal amount of flesh be carved directly from the merchant's body. I'm not kidding. So, the absolutely crucial point here is, how did he fund this massive machine? With a staggering 50% tax rate, Alauddin completely eliminated the local middlemen and went straight to the peasants, taxing them at 50% of their agricultural produce. He squeezed every single ounce of wealth out of the land just to fuel his massive war machine and keep the borders secure. Yet, amazingly, right in the middle of this totalitarian, heavily monitored state, cultures still found a way to breathe. The legendary poet and musician Amir Khusro completely thrived during this exact era. He proudly called himself the Parrot of India, and he championed the local dialect, Hindavi, over the more elitist courtly Persian. He is actually credited with creating the sitar and the qawwali, seamlessly blending Indian and Persian musical traditions together. It's such a fascinating paradox, right? You have this brutal, calculating dictator sitting on the throne, and this beautiful cultural renaissance happening right below him. But again, we inevitably run into the ultimate flaw of absolute tyranny. What happens when an empire relies entirely on one dictator's fear to function, and then that dictator dies? The very moment Alauddin died, his carefully constructed market controls just collapsed overnight. His trusted general, Malik Kafur, attempted a really bloody power grab, which just led to a spiral of chaotic assassinations. Within just a few years, the Khalji dynasty completely wiped itself out through brutal internal betrayals. And out of that bloodshed emerged our final chapter today, Section 5, the Tughlaq Experiments, Ambition versus Reality. So, Muhammad bin Tughlaq comes to power, and he inherits a full treasury and a vast, sprawling empire. By all accounts, the guy was a brilliant intellectual, but his real-world execution was just disastrous. First, he decides that ruling from the center of India made more strategic sense than ruling from the north. Okay, fair enough. But his solution? He orders the entire population of Delhi to pack up their lives and march 1,200 kilometers south to Daulatabad. The execution of this was an absolute catastrophe. It was a grueling 40-day march through intense heat and disease that cost countless lives and completely alienated his subjects. And then, realizing he had left the north totally vulnerable to Mongol attacks, just 8 years later, he reverses the order. He makes them march back. The treasury was completely decimated and the spirit of his people was just broken. Okay, so you have an empty treasury. How do you refill it? Tughlaq tries another incredibly modern yet disastrously executed idea: fiat token currency. He issued brass and copper coins, officially declaring that they held the exact same value as silver. In economic theory, actually a pretty great concept. In reality, he completely forgot to include any anti-counterfeiting measures. Because brass was so cheap and easy to get, literally every household in the empire turned into a DIY home mint, just churning out fake coins. The economy totally collapsed in hyperinflation, and eventually, the Sultan had to buy back mountains of worthless fake brass coins with his remaining real silver. Just a total mess. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. If a single thread holds an empire together, what happens when the ruler pulls just a bit too hard? From the early Arab incursions to the slave kings, from Alauddin's iron grip all the way to Tughlaq's disastrous economic experiments, these 600 years show us just how incredibly fragile power actually is. You can conquer with swords, you can control with fear, and you can experiment with economies all you want. But if you push that thread too far, if you lose the delicate balance between your own ambition and the actual reality of your people, the entire empire unravels. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible race through history, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.